This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. On today's episode, I talked to author Cristina García about her latest novel, Vanishing Maps. Vanishing Maps is a follow-up to Cristina García's acclaimed first novel, Dreaming in Cuban. That first novel was published 30 years ago now, but the novel introduces us again to the Del Pino family 20 years after Celia met, well, an ambiguous end when she seems to be walking into the ocean. Her children and grandchildren are scattered and making their lives all over the world. The novel moves us from Cuba to Los Angeles to Berlin and Moscow. As the title of the novel suggests, the maps become unnecessary as these characters continue to battle for a sense of identity and of place. Ivanito is in Berlin. He has a gift for languages and also for recreating himself, somehow making himself invisible to give voice to some other part of himself or to someone else. He carries the idea of the terrors his mother felt of being erased. Pilar Puente is adrift in Los Angeles, struggling to find some success or create some kind of livelihood as a sculptor and the single mother of a young son. In Moscow, Ivanito's cousin Irina has become the wealthy owner of a lingerie company, but she remains alone and deeply lonely in the wake of her parents' deaths and her estrangement from her Cuban heritage. Celia, back in Havana, is about to reunite with her lost lover Gustavo. What can being older and so much time apart have done to diminish their bond? The novel covers a momentous year in the lives of these family members and their constant search for home and the sometimes fragile bonds we have with those we love the most. I spoke to Cristina García about her latest novel, Vanishing Maps. Well, so this novel obviously stands alone. You don't have to have read Dreaming in Cuban to read this novel and understand it and appreciate it. But we do get to return to those characters that we first met in that first novel. 20 years have passed and a lot has happened. Can you just set the table for us and tell us a little bit about Vanishing Maps?
Well, Vanishing Maps emerged out of my revisiting Dreaming in Cuban for an adaptation for theater. And so I hadn't really, it's not like I've been haunted by those characters or wondering particularly what had happened to them. To me, my first novel was a discrete event. When people ask me, well, does Celia survive? Or so-and-so, I was like, I don't know. But anyway, I became interested because rereading the novel and then adapting it, I spent a lot of time with them. And then I did start wondering what happened to Celia. Did she make it back to shore? Did she ever get in contact with that long lost lover? You know, did she die whispering the name of El Comandante, on her lips, all of that. And then of course there were kids and teenagers, all of whom were growing up and adults moving into middle and late middle age. And so I thought, why not? And so that's how it started. And I picked 20 years later because, as you said, so much had happened. And also politically, seismically, the Soviet Union fell apart. And along with that came that support to Cuba and this huge explosion, diasporic explosion of Cubans around the world. So that's why. And here we are.
I love this idea. I feel like we are now readers and audiences of works where, a series ends or a novel ends and it's a little ambiguous and maybe JR is still alive. I don't know. Maybe
Right.
can come back. Maybe it's that ambiguous.
No one ever dies in popular culture, right?
That's right. And it is open-ended enough. We don't know what happens. There's a cliffhanger. Maybe even we can perceive it that way. Haunted by the characters also. I mean, as you say, things have happened pretty seismically, pretty politically, that would then prompt us to wonder, gosh, I wonder what Celia would have made of this years on. or I
Mhm.
wonder what could have possibly become of Pilar, and so on. I mean, this
Mm.
novel covers so much ground geographically. There's a lot of spaces here. We're in Havana, we're in Miami, we're in Moscow, Berlin. We trot the globe with these characters, including the children and grandchildren of Celia. So this is something I think of as such like a paradigm of your work, this idea of displacement, of travel, of migration. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of Vanishing Maps?
Sure, thank you. Oh, and I appreciate your observations too. Yeah, I think too often maybe for, well, I don't know whom thinks this, but I think too often characters get compartmentalized in terms of their social, national, cultural allegiances, when the reality is so much more complex. I think of my own daughter who's Cuban and Japanese and Jewish on her paternal grandfather's side, and I sort of watch closely to see where her allegiances would, how they would evolve and where they would end up. I mean, she's only 30, so they're still obviously evolving, but I found that old notions of nationality, of belonging, even of identity are growing more and more supple. And we're not identified in the same way we were used to identifying and being identified by others, when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. So I wanted to kind of grapple with that and grapple with this notion of in this big bang explosion of a world where people are hurtling to all parts of the globe and bringing parts of their past with them, but also confronting all of these new environments and other cultures. What does that mean? What are the traditional notions of identity mean in this kind of world? And so I think that's part of why part of my interest in this. And also and you shake this world sideways and out pops another cousin who nobody knew about, who grew up in Moscow. And I surprised myself with what was going on. I surprised myself with each of the characters. I couldn't have predicted any of their trajectories when I was going in.
Is that right? Oh, I want to ask you about that. But I'm so curious about what you're saying to me. I'm thinking about, like, my friends who take DNA tests, and then suddenly they're like, I knew I was, I knew I sort of gravitated to, this or that nationality or this or that.
Right.
Uh,
Portuguese food or whatever. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And that's kind of beautiful. I feel like we're all always sort of trying to find our place, even if we're quite grounded in a place, that we're sort of always thinking about our identity and where else we might fit. Place
Mhm.
becomes a very kind of fluid thing. I feel like in your novel, there's this idea of being very grounded in a place, even while there's a reaching out for other places for a variety of reasons. Ivanito is someone who I'm madly in love with. Uh,
Ah,
he's son of Felicia,
mhm.
met a terrible end, but the Pilar is able to get him out of Cuba. And then 20 years on, here we are in Vanishing Maps, and he's very much on his own. He's a successful translator and a performer. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about this idea of translation, of like a linguistic translation, of a literary translation, of this cultural translation. You write in the novel, Ivanito translated these languages, but also their cultures, their histories, their erotics, their losses, shape-shifting from one lexicon to the next. I wonder if you can talk about Ivanito a little bit.
Again, he was a relatively minor character in Dreaming Cuban, except toward the end when he became pivotal because everyone wanted him to do a certain thing. Celia wanted him to stay in Cuba, and he became a pawn essentially. He became emblematic of the strife between the Cubans who left and Cubans who remained. So I was very curious about him, and he had studied Russian as a boy, not that unusual in 60s Cuba. And so, yes, that he ends up in Berlin seems perfectly fitting for me, because Berlin has always, I mean, except during the Third Reich, which is a big except, but think about Berlin, Weimar Berlin in the 20s, or even, Berlin today, or since the fall of the wall. It has been a magnet for people who haven't fit anywhere else, people who are multiply hyphenated, who want to, who are artistically experimental, who just don't want to live in the prescribed ways that they were told that they should be living. In Berlin, anything is possible. And I think he talks about Berlin in the 90s at one point, and people living in abandoned buildings and jerry rigging this and that. And I just thought, I don't know, it's funny to say he's a kind of alter ego for me, because I'm not like him. And Pilar is probably closer to me in many ways, but I loved his freedom and I loved his willingness just to be out there, whether he was on stage performing as these Cuban divas, or teaching his students at the university, or, taking on his little nephew, whom he really coddles and kind of teaches him the ways of Berlin. I think for me, he's the center of the novel. He's sort of the cynosure of this galaxy of cousins and families and allegiances, and he has this sort of centrifugal pull on everyone, because he represents the freedom, I think, to some degree, a kind of freedom. And then paradoxically, of course, he's being haunted by his mother, who wants to pull him over to the other side.
Yeah.
But he, under the circumstances, he's pretty nice to her. I don't know if you have a choice when it comes to a ghost, but I mean, but yeah, I don't know. For me, he was, such an interesting mix of personal opportunities.
Yeah, he's so, and granted, he not only is he being haunted, but he's being haunted by other things. I mean, he has not had an easy life, an easy childhood.
Mm-hmm.
He understands that this is his life, that this is where he is now. Yes, he experienced those things. I feel like he's just so smart. He's good at everything. He seems to be really good at everything. I love the way he even has this part in Pilar's punk girl group back in New York City.
Right.
I love it. And I feel like that was even part of the root system for him, of his understanding of art and culture even. I mean, I feel like his politics are interesting, if sometimes a little bit nebulous, because he's so given over instead to so many other real interests.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's the subject of translation, but also of, when talking about moving through the world, or about being an immigrant, but the idea of translation as it pertains to so many other things in this book, literature, also music. And music is something in your novel, I wish there were like a Spotify playlist, but super wide ranging.
I thought about that at one point, to do a playlist.
Really? I mean, it's so diverse. We have Chopin, we have opera, Monteverdi, we have La Lupe, we have Iggy Pop, U2, David Bowie. I mean, it's like this.
The Ramones.
The Ramones, yes, the Ramones got highlighted. It's just wonderful and diverse. And then film, we have like the mention of Almodovar for sure. I just want to know, though, about music and the part it plays for you. I mean, clearly you have, probably, I'm assuming, a very deep and abiding love for music and art, but I feel like, wow, music really comes through in this novel in such beautiful ways.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, I paid very close attention to music, and I wanted each character, in a sense, to have their own soundtrack, and for it not necessarily to be predictable, that it was a mix of things. People have said it's an old cliche about music being another language, but it isn't another language. And And so I would add that to everybody. Yes, he's fluent in German, Russian, Spanish, and English, but also music. And my daughter, she's not a professional clarinetist, but grew up with a lot of music. And she, in the language her musician friends speak, is another language. It sort of amplifies their existences in meaningful ways, I think. And so, yeah, I think you got it with the whole translation thing. It's not just translating a sentence in Russian to a sentence in Spanish. It's about all of the associations and that come along with it. Just like all of us reading a novel or bringing all of our chains of associations with us as we bear down and surrender over to reading. And I think to be a good translator, you have to open yourself up to other rhythms and musical possibilities. A good translator is like a wonderful musician.
And it makes so much sense with him. And it's all through the novel. I want to talk a bit about magic realism. So your novel, because it picks up 20 years later, and it's been 30 years now since Dreaming in Cuban came out. I feel like as a reader in 2023, magic realism in literature, in film, and I will say also on, the many productions we have access to now through streaming services, right? I don't know. I don't know if I want to say that magic realism has become something different. I really don't know. I'm not sure. I know that in literature, when it works well, whatever that means to me, it's as indispensable as any other part of the novel. The magic realism, how do I say this? As I'm reading the novel, I almost take it in stride that Ivanito has this halo. And it's like it's just like another thing he's wearing. It's like a hat. For me at a certain point, it would just became part of the who he is. And it wasn't sort of sticking out with this neon sign that says, "Hey, magic realism over here," which I can't stand when that happens sometimes.
I agree. I agree.
The idea of magic realism, it's I don't know how to say it. It's so, I don't know, organic. It's so in the weave, in the fabric. It's so, I don't know. It's it's just so real.
I so appreciate that. No, I mean, like you, I really am averse to very self-conscious magical realism opportunities. Like, oh, okay, we've gone 4 pages and let's have this owl talk to you or whatever. Not happening. But I do think of the magic that happens as extensions of character, just the way other things are extensions of character, like the way, in the end, the way, I won't be specific about who goes to bed with whom, but that they become that's an extension of character. So kind of everything you do, how you experience life, whether you allow magic consciously or unconsciously into your life, whether you have a halo that only you and your little nephew can see or not, but the magic of performing as someone else entirely, taking on another personality and creating that illusion for an audience in Berlin of 1950s Cuban divas. I mean, that's kind of magic realism too. So I think it's all in the level of specificity. Like everything else, it's all in the details, and to get those details right and to have them feel organic, to use your word. You don't want it sticking out like a toadstool from your sentence. It is part and parcel of the world. The magic in the dreaming and the releasing and the lovemaking. It is all part of the same world.
Yes, there's truth in it. I try to tell my students who react a little bit against anything that's a little, or they embrace it, but the ones who sort of can't get into a story if there's anything too surreal, or if there's magic realism, I say to them, lean into that, because what you will find is reality. And they look at me like, what? But I say to them, trust me, the most real elements of a character or of a place or of a situation, you will arrive at some answers about the realness or the reality, or a resonance there. Look, go in there, and there's, and they're like, okay. And I feel very strongly about that. And I just feel like, right, it's not just this super artificial thing that's imposed, like the writers who have said to me, I love to pepper in a little Spanish. And I say, no, it shouldn't be peppered in after the fact. It's something that should come. Code switching is something that comes very naturally and organically.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I don't think it's it's frippery. I don't think it's something that's pasted on or an afterthought. If it's not integral to the world, then it probably doesn't belong.
Pilar says this. Pilar says, obsessive, ruinous love ran in my family. Many of these characters have this very particular quality that is so human and so resonant. And that is that they are obsessive. They are single-minded about love or politics or each other and their family. I found that your novel, with all of these moving parts, manages these little windows into these characters somehow. So when you end one chapter and you see the title of the next one and the name of the next character, you realize that you missed them, and you want to see what's like. You're sort of like, oh, Pilar again, or Ivanito's here. And that appeal, I think, is largely due to this idea, these idiosyncrasies of their obsessiveness and their single-mindedness about one thing or another. So I feel like, I don't know what it says about me, but I feel like when I'm reading, it's sort of like, these are people whose lives are so broken open for us. These ruinous, terrible loves or relationships, deaths and wars and revolution and all of these things. And I feel like it's as you said before, where it's most specific is where there's such a universality, there's such a resonance. So I love how obsessive almost everybody is about something or other in these moments that you capture in the novel.
That is just so lovely to hear. Thank you. So generous. All I can say is that I think there is maybe a certain poignancy to survival, and each in their own way, whether it's our Muscovite Irina, selling her lingerie, or Lourdes battling for the Elian, I think he's called something else in the book, Elian Gonzalez case, or everybody in one way or another, or even Pilar's, how she nurses her failures, but keeps still looking for, well, what else could I do? I don't know. I do think that they do keep trying and keep reinventing themselves as much as they can, given who they are and kind of all that they have inherited and all that they've done battle with in their lives. But I don't know. I mean, even the Lourdes character, who's the furthest possible, as you can imagine. To me, there's also poignancy in her battling, in her self-righteousness, in the blind spots we have about ourselves and others, about the forgiveness we offer, and the hurts that we continue nursing. I mean, it's they're all very, to me, very human. And I don't know, I personally love to read and hopefully write characters that will keep you as engaged as a good friend does over time.
Yeah. And you really, they do. I mean, at first it's this golpe, right? They're so, oh my gosh, Lourdes, my goodness. It was Eliseo Gonzalez, right? Anyway,
Right,
but
right.
it's not that they soften. It's you just sort of get to know them, and it's all good. It's all okay. I interviewed Richard Rousseau recently. His new novel is Somebody's Fool, and in that novel there are twins.
Oh,
They're boy girl, they're fraternal boy, a brother and sister twin. And he said something to me when I revealed to him that I am a twin to a boy.
you're too? Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
And I said that to him and he said, "Oh my gosh, I'm terrified. I hope I got it right." And he said, when you write about twins, um, there's a lot that the author needs to get right. It's like writing about anything else. Yes, we use our imagination and we try to write the characters as honestly as we can. And so I was thinking about I just talked to him recently. So I was thinking about this when I was reading your novel too, is this idea of twins
There's
is
two sets of them as well.
there's
Yeah.
two sets of them. I didn't want to spoil that part, but there's two sets of them.
Sorry.
Um, but I find that so interesting. I think back to the first time I discovered this, and I was very self-conscious about it when I had a professor in a Shakespeare class in undergrad say to me something like, twins are in Shakespeare are just inherently comical. Like they're just going to be comical. I never got over that idea about twins
That's
in
kind of harsh
literature.
medicine there. Yeah.
Yeah. But in your novel, there's really something else going on with twins that I just found so interesting. And again, I don't I feel like every page had something I wanted to ask you about, and I thought, I'm going to spoil everything for people who listen to this and haven't read the book. I want to ask you lastly about invisibility.
Mm.
There's a lot about invisibility here. It's either a superpower or a secret power. It's described both ways in your book. So it's a positive thing sometimes, and then it can be something negative if it's perceived as something like erasure. So when Ivanito has his mother's diary, he says that she had a quote, a terror of erasure. And
Mm.
he carries that diary of hers with him to all of these different places. And he thinks he can fill perhaps the pages of that book with his own story.
Mm. Mhm.
And I feel like somehow for any of a number of concerns that displaced people face or that women face in some of these relationships where they must come into their own and protect their children or try to survive or fend for their families and so on, that almost sin querer, right? That there's either this need to be invisible but always the terror of erasure, sort of
Mm.
paradoxically. That I just found that idea to be so profound. And it's an idea, I'm not giving away too much, it's an idea that we encounter at the very beginning of this novel, and and you sort of carry it with you all the way to the last page without spoiling too much. But I wanted to ask you about this idea of erasure and invisibility and what that means to you with Vanishing Maps.
Yeah. Well, I think you're officially now the best reader I could have hoped for this novel.
Oh my God. Yay, bucket list.
Just want to put that out there with a big thank you. Yes, that was one of the themes. And in fact, the title Vanishing Maps alludes to that as well, which is whether you become invisible, will invisibility, or the world that you knew is no longer visible except inside you somehow and coming out, in memory or nostalgia or longing, or whether you sacrifice your visibility for someone else, whether it's your children or I mean, I think that whole notion, especially as immigrants and especially as quote unquote, like others in around the world. What does it mean to be, with one foot in and one foot out? What do these multiply hyphenated identities mean? Can you choose your visibility, or is it chosen for you? I mean, all of these questions with all of these characters in different contexts, and what if the world around you, as I just mentioned a little earlier, what if the world around you, the maps you had come to rely on, are no longer available? What do you rely on then? And do those distortions change the visibility? I mean, I'm going on and on and on, but essentially, as we were talking about the flexibility and the but there's a kind of fungibility to invisibilities, and part of it is choice and part of it is imposed. And so how do you negotiate that? How do you negotiate yourself? How does one negotiate their way to selfhood given all of this? And I think each of the characters in their own way are struggling with that. Pilar feels invisible as an artist, and she's trying to find her way. Ivanito feels most visible as someone else when he's dressed up in drag and performing. Even the little boy, Azul, his ghost of a great aunt takes him to the, does this really happen? Do they really go to the North Pole? There's always this questioning of, is what you're seeing true? And is how you're seeing me in any way resembling how I see myself? I mean, it's a kind of house of mirrors in a way.
Cristina Garcia, thank you so much. What an honor, what a thrill to get to talk to you about Vanishing Maps.
Pleasure for me. Thank you so much for your interest and your wonderful, wonderful questions.
Cristina Garcia is the author of Vanishing Maps. It's published by Knopf. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.